The elderly man is pronounced dead, but what the priest sees prompts him to call the police immediately. The story of forgiveness, love, and second chances. You will witness the moment when death is not the end, but a beginning. Watch until the very end. Don Ernesto's house was on a dirt road where hardly anyone ever passed by. The walls were very old, marked by the passage of time. The paint was peeling, and there were many thin cracks, as if the house were tired. The gate was always ajar and creaked when the wind blew, and he was like that too, tired. Since Doña Teresa left more than 10 years ago, Don Ernesto stopped opening the windows. He said that the sun brought back memories, and remembering hurt. That's why he lived in darkness. The living room smelled strongly of dampness, of things that had been stored away for a long time. There was an old radio on top of the wardrobe, a yellowed portrait of his wife above the fireplace. He spent hours sitting in the armchair that used to be hers, too. Sometimes he fell asleep right there, with a thin blanket over his legs and his gaze lost on some random spot on the wall. Every day was the same. He got up early, made coffee for one, and set 2 cups on the table out of habit or hope. Then he would remove one and take only his own. He always ate the same thing, a piece of bread and a little old cheese. He didn't feel like cooking anything else. "What for?" the neighbors would murmur. They hardly ever saw him. From time to time, a lady across the street would bring him fresh bread. He would thank her with a nod, but then immediately close the door. He avoided talking and laughing. He couldn't even remember what that was like anymore. He only talked to the radio when they played a song that he and Teresa used to dance to when they were young. "That was ours, my old lady," he would murmur with teary eyes. He kept her letters in an envelope hidden inside the closet. He read them from time to time, always in the same place on the bed, on the side where she used to sleep. He ran his hand over the sheets, as if he could still feel her warmth. He slept there with her nightgown folded under his pillow. Sometimes, Don Ernesto took out the photo album. He would pause at a picture of the two of them when they were younger, laughing at a picnic. He would squint his eyes and smile a little, but it was a sad smile, the kind that comes when you miss someone so much that it hurts. And he would whisper, "You should have taken me with you, Teresa." The nights were even worse. The house creaked, the wind whistled through the cracks in the window, and the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder in the silence. Sometimes, Don Ernesto would talk to himself. "Teresa, can you still hear me? Do you still remember us?" That's how he lived. A man who had everything and suddenly found himself alone, not because he wanted to be, but because of absence. Life took little pieces of him away, bit by bit. First his friends, then his brothers, and finally her and the daughter who went far away and never saw him again. And what remained was an old man with a heart full of memories, walking slowly through the cold rooms of a house where time seemed to have stopped. Don Ernesto was still alive, but inside he seemed to have been gone for a long time. It was a cloudy morning in San Marcos. The sky looked tired, and the street was as quiet as ever. Doña Mariela, the neighbor across the street, was watering her plants when she heard something. A sharp, quick noise, as if something heavy had fallen. She stopped, looked around, but saw nothing. Then she looked toward Don Ernesto's house. Everything was the same as always. Closed windows, drawn curtains, the gate ajar. She thought about ignoring it. Maybe it was the cat knocking over a flower pot, she told herself. But something tightened in her chest, a discomfort, a premonition. She dried her hands on her apron and crossed the street. She called out from the sidewalk, "Don Ernesto, is everything okay in there?" Silence. She tried again, louder. "Don Ernesto, it's me, Mariela. Is everything okay?" Nothing, not a sound, not even the slow footsteps of him going to open the door. And that was strange. She pushed the gate slowly. The hinges screeched. She climbed the 2 steps to the porch, her heart racing. She knocked loudly on the door. "Don Ernesto, open up, please." That's when she realized the door wasn't locked. Fearful, but with no time to think, she turned the knob. "Excuse me," she said quietly as she entered. The smell of dampness was strong, the air heavy, and there, right in the middle of the living room, between the armchair and the coffee table, was Don Ernesto, lying on the floor, on his side with one arm stretched out and the other bent under his body, his eyes closed, his mouth half open. "My God, Don Ernesto!" Mariela cried, running toward him. She knelt down, touched his shoulder, and shook him gently. "It's me, Mariela. Listen to me. Can you hear me?" Nothing. Fear took hold of her. She grabbed the phone with trembling fingers and dialed emergency services. Her voice barely came out. "Hello, this is an emergency. There's a man here on the street. He fell down. He's not responding. He's cold." The person on the other end asked her to calm down. They told her the ambulance was on its way. She remained kneeling there, her hand on his wrist, trying to feel a heartbeat. But the silence was frightening. Only the clock on the wall marked the time, which seemed frozen. The minutes seemed endless. Shortly after, the ambulance arrived with its siren on low, respecting the atmosphere of the house. 2 paramedics entered. One knelt beside Ernesto, placed his fingers on his neck, then looked at his partner and nodded, slowly. "He has a weak pulse, but he does have one," he murmured. Mariela put her hands to her mouth, feeling relief and fear at the same time. "He'll be fine. We'll do everything we can, ma'am, but he has to go to the hospital." They carefully placed Don Ernesto on the stretcher. His body seemed weightless, without strength, just skin and memories. As they carried him through the door, Mariela grabbed the rosary around his neck and prayed softly. "Please, God, don't let him go like this. All alone, not like this." The ambulance door closed. The vehicle drove slowly down the dirt road, kicking up a little dust, and the house remained there, silent, empty, with the armchair still turned toward the radio and 2 cups on the table, one of them untouched, as always. At the hospital, time seemed to stand still. The hallways were silent, except for a lone beeping sound coming from a distant room. It was dawn, one of those cold ones where the sky outside looks almost gray because it's so dark. In the emergency room, bright white lights illuminated Don Ernesto's motionless body. The doctors did everything they could, but he seemed to have given up. The attempts to revive him lasted minutes that seemed like hours. One of them, Dr. Enrique, already experienced, knew that moment well, when the body no longer responds, when the machines start to show the same number, when silence weighs more than any words. With a steady hand, but a clearly sad face, he looked at the team. He lowered his head slightly and said in a low but firm voice, "Time of death, 4:12 in the morning." Everything stopped for a second. They turned off the sound of the monitor. A nurse turned off the ventilator. The other nurse, whose name was Marina, approached carefully. She closed Ernesto's eyes with her fingertips, placed a white sheet over his chest, and stared at him for a few seconds. "He looked so peaceful," she said, almost in a whisper. Enrique took a deep breath and washed his hands in silence. It wasn't the first time he had lost a patient, but for some reason, that morning it hurt differently. "Does he have any family?" he asked. "They say his daughter lives far away. They've already contacted her." Enrique nodded, took the chart, made the necessary notes, and signed the papers. On the last line, in simple letters that weighed a ton, he wrote, "Death confirmed." Then he looked at the body one more time. An elderly, frail man with a peaceful face, but his features told a whole story, a past that no one there knew, a heart that stopped at 4:12 a.m., carrying secrets, loves, guilt, and silences. "Notify reception. The body can now be released," said the doctor in a broken voice as he left the room. Marina stayed a moment longer, approached the bed, gently touched Ernesto's cold hand, and said softly, "Go in peace, sir. May God be with you on this new path." Then she turned off one of the lights, leaving the room in dim light, and closed the door slowly behind her. There, in that cold hospital room, lay the body of a man who just a few hours earlier had been drinking coffee from a forgotten cup and was now ready to be taken away. The news came very early. The phone at the rectory rang while the sky was still dark. On the other end of the line, the voice was soft and sad. They told Father Mateo that Don Ernesto had passed away in the early hours of the morning. They asked him to say the funeral mass. It was his duty as a priest, but for him, it was more than that. Mateo stood for a moment with the phone in his hand, staring into space. Ernesto's name stirred something inside him that he couldn't explain. He swallowed hard, closed his eyes tightly, and took a deep breath. They hadn't spoken in over 30 years. 30 years since the last time they sat together on a bench, sharing laughter and memories until they had a fight. It was a silly argument, but it grew out of proportion. Neither of them wanted to give in, and time, cruel as it is, did the rest. He slowly went downstairs, carefully putting on his shoes. He put on his cassock with an almost solemn slowness. As he got ready, his mind traveled to the past. He saw moments as if they were happening again, running through the streets of San Marcos with Ernesto when they were children, swimming in the river, fighting over silly things, making plans that never came to fruition. He remembered the day he himself gave the blessing at Ernesto's wedding to Teresa, how his eyes sparkled with love. Now he was going to say the last mass for that same friend. He arrived at the hospital with a serious expression on his face. The doorman recognized him and simply nodded. In the hallway, the sound of his shoes echoed loudly on the mosaic floor. He stopped in front of the door where the body lay. He did not enter immediately. He stood there with his hand on the doorknob, silent. His heart was beating fast, as if he were about to face something he had avoided for many years. When he finally entered, he saw Ernesto's body covered up to the chest, his eyes closed, his face pale. For a moment he did not see an old man. He saw the boy who grew up with him. He saw the man who was once like a brother to him. He approached, slowly removed his hat, and placed it on a chair. He stood there staring. Father Mateo murmured, "You take me back to the past, you know." He sat down next to the stretcher, looked around as if hoping no one would see him so fragile. "We drifted apart over something silly, and look where it got us. Here I am, praying for you, but it's too late, isn't it?" Silence. "I should have looked for you so many times. I was angry, yes, but deep down I was just hurt, because to me you were my brother, and when you disappeared, it hurt, but I also walked away, didn't I?" Mateo lowered his head, brought his hand to his chest where his rosary was, and cried silently, without exaggeration, just sincere tears from someone carrying too much weight in his heart. After a few minutes, he got up, wiped his face, took a deep breath, and prepared to fulfill his mission. But inside, he knew that this Mass was not just an obligation, it was his last chance to talk to the friend he had let go. Outside, the sky was beginning to clear. The city was slowly waking up, unaware that in that room, a priest, Father Mateo, was reuniting too late. The plane landed silently, as if the world itself understood how heavy that moment was. Clara hurried off the plane, her eyes red, her face pale, and her heart beating fast. In her hands, she carried only a small bag. There was no pause, no coffee, no rest, just a car waiting outside with a driver holding a sign with her name on it. The drive to the hospital was a blur. The trees passed by quickly. The noise of the city sounded distant, and her fingers trembled in her lap. Clara hadn't spoken to her father in years. It wasn't because of a fight, but because of distance. Those distances that grow in silence, that become abysses. It was cold outside, but inside her, The cold was stronger. When she arrived at the hospital, she walked determinedly toward the reception desk, but just saying her father's name broke her voice. Ernesto Ruiz. They told me The girl at the reception desk looked down. She just pointed to the hallway. Clara walked as if she were floating. Her feet were heavy. Each step echoed on the cold tiles, as if warning her of something. When she entered the room, the world stopped. He was there, lying still, covered up to his chest with a white sheet, the little hair he had left, his face full of years, his hands one on top of the other. The father she had always seen as strong now looked fragile, small. She took 2 steps toward him and fell to her knees. Dad. Her voice didn't come out the way she wanted it to. It was low, broken. She rested her head on his arm, as she did when she was a child, and cried. You left without hearing what I needed to tell you. The tears flowed freely. Tears fell onto the sheet. She squeezed his cold hand with both hands. I should have come sooner. I should have called you more. I always had an excuse. No, I'm busy. I'll talk to you later. And now there is no later. She lifted her face, looking at the silence in the room. I blamed you for so many things. For being distant, quiet, absent. But I was too. I also distanced myself. The words came out between sobs, with pauses, as if she were trying to get out everything she had kept inside for years. I waited for you to come looking for me, but I never thought of going to you. And now I would give anything to hear you say to me, daughter, just one more time. She took a photo out of the bag. It was old, the 2 of them sitting on a park bench. Clara was about 5 years old. They were both laughing as they looked at a melting ice cream. She placed the photo on her chest. I loved you, Dad. Even when I said I didn't. Even when I stayed silent. Even from afar. And I just wanted you to know that. The silence remained heavy. Clara rested her head on her dad's chest, as she did when she was a child, and stayed there, hugging the lost time, crying softly, wishing with all her heart for one more chance. But at that moment, all she had was his body and the pain of someone who had arrived too late. The afternoon was dark, as if the sky were crying too. Clara sat on a cold hospital bench, her eyes swollen from crying. When the doctor approached, he said in a calm and respectful voice, Mrs. Ruiz, we are going to begin preparations. Can you go to his house? We need clothes for the wake. Something he would wear, something that was his style, clean clothes, preferably dark, and, if possible, something he liked. Clara just nodded, unable to say anything. She took the key out of her bag, looked one last time at the door of the room where the body lay, and left. The walk to her father's house was silent. The streets looked emptier than ever. When she reached the door, she took a deep breath before entering. The gate made a noise as if complaining about the visit, and the house still smelled the same. That mixture of dampness and time standing still, the same heavy silence. She entered slowly, running her hand along the walls, looking at every detail. The old radio, the cup still on the table, everything the same. She went up to his room and opened the closet. Everything was folded, but covered in dust. Old clothes, worn shirts, some with his scent. As she pulled a drawer out of the dresser, she heard a sharp noise like paper tearing. Something was stuck between the bottom of the drawer and the furniture. She carefully pulled it out. They were old papers, letters, some almost complete, others in pieces, handwritten, with that shaky handwriting she recognized from afar. The same handwriting that once helped her write her name. She began to read a page. Clara, my daughter, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe I won't even have the courage to send it to you, but I need to write. I need to say that I'm so sorry. Her heart tightened. Her hands trembled. She grabbed another piece with a torn, crumpled edge. I'm sorry for leaving you alone when you needed me most. I was a coward. I thought that giving you space was giving you freedom, but what I did was push you away. And today, I just want to come back. She collapsed right there, kneeling on the floor, with the papers scattered around her. She cried like a child, like someone reading words she always wanted to hear, but it was too late. There were several letters. In one, he talked about how much he missed their conversations on the couch. In another, he said he listened to the songs she liked, just to remember her. In another, written on small sheets of paper, he said, "Every day I think about calling you, but I'm afraid you won't want to hear my voice." Clara pressed the papers against her chest. She was crying loudly now, sobbing. It was as if every word in those letters tore away a piece of the regret that lived inside her. She felt anger, sadness, relief, all at the same time. And for the first time, she understood. He didn't know how to love, but he did love. In his own way, silently, fearfully, with mistakes, yes, but with love. Clara grabbed one of her father's cleanest shirts. It was dark blue, smelling of mothballs. She put it together with the letters and whispered, "I'm going to take all this with me, Dad, because now I know you loved me, even though you didn't know how to show it." And in that old room, among used clothes and letters that were never sent, a daughter felt that a part of what had been lost was beginning to be rebuilt, even if it was late, even if it hurt. In the hospital chapel, the wake had already begun. Don Ernesto's body lay there in the open coffin, covered with simple but beautiful flowers. The candle beside it flickered, as if it too felt the same coldness in the room. Some neighbors arrived, whispering, giving short hugs, looking on with respect. But Father Mateo stood at the back of the chapel for several minutes. He did not approach. With his hands clasped, he looked at the floor, his cassock neatly arranged, his face serious, but his eyes carried a weight, an old weight, something he had been hiding for so long that he no longer knew where guilt ended and exhaustion began. A woman spoke to him softly. "Father, aren't you going to give the blessing?" He just nodded, but still didn't move. When he finally walked toward the coffin, his steps were slow. The sound of the wood on the floor echoed. He approached, but didn't look. He kept his eyes fixed on the flowers, the candles, anything but his friend's face. He approached Clara and said in a low voice, "May I say a prayer?" She nodded with tears in her eyes, but before he began, Mateo paused, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes. Inside him, a memory came flooding back. It was 1992, a conversation that ended badly, an anger that was never resolved. He knew what he had done. He knew that that year he had said things he shouldn't have. He judged. He turned his back. He broke the friendship, and he never had the courage to return. There, standing in front of his childhood friend's coffin, he was not only wearing his cassock, he was wearing silence. The silence of someone who should have asked for forgiveness, who should have returned sooner. The prayer began, but the words came out stuck. "Lord, receive this son of yours who finds the peace he did not have here in the world." When he finished, he took a step back and whispered, "Forgive me, Ernesto, for everything." On the other side of the coffin, Clara approached silently, her eyes swollen, her hands cold. She touched her father's hand carefully and squeezed it gently. "Dad," her voice broke. "I forgive you." She paused. She took a deep breath as tears fell. "Even though you haven't asked for it, I forgive you." And then she lowered her head. She stood there holding that hand that no longer responded to touch, but still held all the memories of childhood, of quiet Christmases, of unreasonable scoldings, of absences that hurt more than harsh words. Clara closed her eyes. She didn't want to see anyone else. She just wanted that moment. "I love you, Dad. Despite everything, I love you." And in the silence of that chapel, two people said goodbye to the same man. One with the weight of old guilt, the other with the painful relief of forgiveness. And time, for a moment, seemed to stand still. Shortly after, the chapel was empty, except for Clara, sitting on one of the front pews, her eyes unblinking. She stared at the coffin, at something, anything. To one side, a tall candle burned slowly. The flame flickered at times, but it did not go out. The silence was so deep that you could hear the wood creak with the change in temperature. Outside, the wind moved the trees, and the city slept. But inside, Clara couldn't close her eyes. Every minute, memories came flooding back, some beautiful, others painful. She hugged her coat to her chest and whispered, "You're still here, aren't you, Dad? In some way, you are." And it was at that moment that the candle flickered strongly. The flame suddenly grew, as if taking a breath, and then went out. There was no wind, no one nearby. Clara stood still and looked around. Her heart was beating fast. She got up and walked over to the candle. She touched the wax with her finger. It was still warm, but there was no explanation for that. She tried to light it again with a match, but the flame wouldn't catch. The match lit and went out in the air. 3 attempts. 4. She stepped back, and that's when she heard a sharp crack. The sound came from the small table next to where the photos of her father were. A picture frame with an old photo of him and her mother cracked on its own without anyone touching it. A line cut the glass in half, separating Ernesto and Teresa into 2. Clara put her hand to her mouth, her heart pounding. She knelt down, her eyes filled with tears. "Dad, what's going on?" she said softly. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind outside and the silence that grew heavier with each passing minute. Father Mateo entered silently, his eyes tired. He walked to the altar with his hands clasped together. He said nothing, his cassock slightly wrinkled. He just looked at the coffin. The rain began slowly. Fine droplets like tears from the sky hit the tin roof of the chapel. That sound was like a whisper, a lament. Mateo looked up and looked at those present. The room was filled with silence. No one spoke. Only a few blew their noses, trying not to cry. He began the Mass with a trembling voice. "Brothers, it is time to let him go. Let us say a final prayer. Some people were not here earlier when we asked God to take Ernesto in peace. Today, we are here to lay this man to rest, Don Ernesto. A man who, like all of us, made mistakes, loved, kept silent, and left stories in every glance he exchanged." The words came slowly, as if they weighed heavily on his mouth. May this rain outside cleanse the paths. May this silence inside allow us to hear what the soul wants to say, even if it has no words. Clara lowered her head. Tears fell slowly, wetting the handkerchief she held between her fingers. With each sentence from the priest, it was as if another piece of her pain found a way out. Outside, the rain grew stronger, but inside the chapel, no one moved. Everyone was absorbed in the moment. The sound of the raindrops on the roof was like music, sad music, but necessary. And between the unlit candle, the broken glass, the silent crying, and the soft words, there was a feeling that something, even if it was not understood, was still to come. She got up slowly. Her body was shaking. The steps to the altar seemed longer than they were. Everyone in the chapel turned to look at her. No one knew what she was going to say, not even she herself. She only knew that if she didn't speak now, she would never have another chance. She looked at the coffin, looked at the floor, then looked up, took a deep breath, and began in a trembling voice. "I came to find a father I never had." A heavy silence filled the chapel. Everyone held their breath, and now he was gone without knowing that even so, despite everything, I loved him. The tears came again, but she didn't stop. I grew up waiting for him to call me on my birthday, to ask me how I did in school, to get mad at me when I made mistakes. Anything, but he never came. He never came. She paused, wiped her eyes, and we walked away. I went on with my life. I moved far away. I started my own family, and yet every Christmas I would look at the phone, waiting for it to ring. She looked back at the coffin, and today I am here beside his body, with a heart full of questions and full of nostalgia for something I never even experienced. The people on the benches cried silently. Some tried to hide it. Others let the tears flow without shame. It was impossible not to feel. But I also came to say that I forgive him. I forgive him because I understood that his silence was also fear. Fear of not knowing how to love. Fear of not knowing how to be a father. And if he could hear me now, I would just want to say, I love you. Although there were no hugs, although there was no time, although there were no words, she lowered her head and walked away slowly, returning to her pew. Father Mateo approached, looked at Clara affectionately, then picked up a guitar that was in a corner of the chapel, sat down on a simple chair, placed the instrument on his lap, and spoke softly. He and his wife used to dance to this song, and Clara, he once told me, it was the tune that played on the little radio every night when you were a baby. You could only sleep to that music. And then he began to play. It was a simple melody, one of those that seemed to already live inside you. Each chord was like a memory coming back. Clara closed her eyes, felt the sound enter softly, warming her chest. It was like going back in time, as if she were suddenly a little girl again, lying in her crib, listening to the music, smelling the house, waiting for her dad to come and see if she had fallen asleep. Mateo sang softly, his voice trembling but full of feeling. And in that little chapel in the rain, there was no luxury, no show, only the power of a silence broken by musical notes. And in that moment, it wasn't just a farewell. It was a reconnection, a healing, a final embrace, albeit invisible, between a father and daughter who had lived far apart but were now closer than ever. Clara looked again at the few things her father had left in a small box next to the coffin to be buried with him. Some old glasses, her mother's rosary, an envelope with yellowed papers, and among them, a photograph. It was small, folded in half, worn at the edges. When Clara opened it, she felt her heart race. It was the image of a child. He looked about 8 years old. He had straight, dark brown hair and the same face shape as her. But what made Clara put her hand to her mouth were the eyes. They were just like hers. The same gaze, the same sparkle, a look she only saw in the mirror. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. She looked at the back of the photo. There was no date or name, just a faded letter. A J or maybe an F. It was almost illegible. With the photo clutched in her hands, Clara turned and walked toward the altar. Father Mateo was still sitting there, staring at the floor. When she approached, he realized that something was different. "Father, may I ask you something?" He looked up. "Of course, my child." She showed him the photo. "Who is this child?" Father Mateo froze. He stared at the image for several seconds, his eyes already red from crying, filled with tears again. He fell silent for a moment, as if the words were stuck in his throat. "I knew this would come out sooner or later," he said, looking down. He should have told her before. Clara frowned. Her heart was beating fast. "Tell what?" Mateo took a deep breath. He got up slowly, took the photo in his hands, looked at it once more, and then, without beating around the bush, his voice breaking, said, "That boy is your brother." The silence was like a blow to the chest. "How?" Clara could barely breathe. "Your dad had another child before you. It was during a difficult time before he met your mom. He loved a woman, but the relationship ended and the child was born. He never met the child. He didn't have the courage. He was afraid to face it all. And then he buried that story. He hid it even from himself." Clara began to cry. It was a different kind of crying. It was anger. It was surprise. It was pain. All together. Everything. Why did he never say anything? Because he carried shame and guilt. He felt he didn't deserve forgiveness, that it was too late. And when you were born, he saw an opportunity to do things differently. But fear silenced him again. She knelt down, the photo trembling between her fingers. The tears flowed uncontrollably. "Dad, why? Why did you leave me without knowing this?" Why did you live with that secret all by yourself? She approached the coffin and rested her head on the lid. I forgive you. I swear I forgive you, but it hurts. It hurts to know that you carried all that alone without letting me share that pain with you. Her voice came out softly, like a little girl's whisper. I love you, Dad. Even so, with everything, I just wish I had had more time. I'm going to find that boy and tell him that you loved him. She placed the photo on her father's chest, closed her eyes, and stayed there, embracing what was left. A broken photo, a name never spoken, and a love that, though wounded, still wanted to exist. And that's when she heard it. A soft, rapid sound, like the fluttering of tiny wings. She looked up, not quite understanding, and there, right there, on the chapel window, a hummingbird had landed. Its wings were still moving slowly, as if it were watching everything. It wasn't scared. It didn't fly away. It stayed there quietly in front of everyone who was mourning Don Ernesto's passing. But at that moment, no one cried. They just stared. Clara put her hand to her mouth. My God, whispered Father Mateo. When he saw the little bird, he smiled with tears in his eyes. He was silent for a moment, and then spoke in a low voice, as if telling an old secret. Don Ernesto used to say that when the soul finally finds peace, the birds return. Clara closed her eyes. A shiver ran through her body. It was as if that simple gesture of nature had provided the answer she so desperately needed. The confirmation that she had said everything she needed to say, that she had felt everything she needed to feel. The hummingbird stayed there for a few more seconds, then flew away, soared, circled in the air, and disappeared among the trees surrounding the chapel. At that moment, Clara knew. She knew that he had heard her. She knew that he was at peace, and somehow she was too. The Mass had ended, and the chapel was empty. Everyone was waiting for the coffin to be brought out for burial. The dim lights still illuminated the altar, and the smell of burning candles lingered in the air. Clara had gone outside to get some air. Only Father Mateo remained. Alone in the sacristy, he sat on a wooden bench, his hands on his face. His shoulders slumped, as if he were carrying the weight of many years. He suddenly stood up as if something were pushing him from within. He paced back and forth in the small room, his eyes filled with tears, his face wet. Lord, he cried, I ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness for having waited so long, for not having had the courage to go and see him, to ask for his forgiveness while he was still alive. His knees gave way. He fell to the floor, crying loudly, unable to control himself. Your daughter Clara, he said today. I wasted time, and so did I. I also wasted time. I should have sought him out, even though I was ashamed, even though he was angry. But I waited for him to come to me, and he waited too. The cold floor touched his hands, his cassock wet with tears. He raised his eyes to the ceiling of the sacristy, as if pleading, Lord, I know it's too late, but put peace in his heart. Show him that it was not in vain, that he was not forgotten, that there were people who still love him, who still forgive him. He paused, breathing heavily. All the people he left behind, whose hearts he touched, even if only for a second, still love him. Let him be at peace. Let him go in peace. At that moment, there was a sharp sound, a strange noise, as if something had thundered inside the chapel. Father Mateo got up, frightened, ran out of the sacristy, and went straight to the coffin. And then he saw Don Ernesto, with his eyes still closed, but with his eyelids trembling, a slight movement, a blink so soft that it seemed like a hallucination, but it was not. My God, whispered the priest. He approached and put his ear to his old friend's chest. Silence, and then a soft sound, almost inaudible, but real. The priest jumped back. Call the police. Call someone. This isn't normal. The screams were heard throughout the chapel. People who were outside ran inside. Confusion, screams, people crossing themselves, others walking away. A woman fainted. One man shouted that it was a miracle, another that it was witchcraft. Clara ran in, stumbling on the steps, and saw what no one could believe. The body that everyone had already said goodbye to, was moving. The confusion in the chapel looked like a scene from a movie. People screaming, running, crying, not knowing whether to flee or kneel. But in the midst of all that chaos, Father Mateo stood next to the coffin, looking at Don Ernesto as if he were witnessing a miracle or a mystery. The paramedics arrived quickly. One of them, a younger man in a white coat, could hardly believe what he was seeing. He approached, touched Ernesto's neck, and looked for signs. His face changed. In that moment, he opened his eyes wide and turned to everyone. His heart is beating. Silence. A heavy silence filled with fear. It's very weak, almost stopping, but it hasn't stopped. He's not dead. The priest sank onto the nearest bench, his hands covering his face as he cried. Clara, her eyes filled with tears, approached slowly. Dad. The paramedics began procedures immediately. They called an ambulance. They made their way through the crowd. Everyone stepped aside in silence, fearful, respectful. It seemed as if no one could breathe properly. The body that had already been given up for dead was now breathing, weakly, but breathing. The same doctor who had signed the death certificate arrived at the scene. He looked at Ernesto, at the connected machines, at the heartbeat on the portable monitor. His face turned pale. He said only 3 words. This is impossible. But there it was. The heartbeat, faint but present. Don Ernesto was between 2 worlds, not completely here nor completely there, between life and death, between goodbye and starting over. In the hospital that afternoon, they put Ernesto in an isolated room. The lights were dim. The smell of alcohol filled the air. Clara sat down next to the bed, looked at the cables, the machines, the tubes, and looked at her father's face. He didn't move, but there was something there, a presence, a warmth. She grabbed his hand tightly, brought her mouth close to his ear, and with a broken voice said, "You heard me, didn't you? I know you heard me. I forgive you. I love you. And you didn't leave because you heard my goodbye." Tears fell down her face and reached his hand. She rested her head on her father's chest and stayed there, holding on to that little hope like someone holding on to a thin thread between what was and what could still be. The following days were long. In the hospital room, time seemed to stand still. Outside, life went on. People walking, cars passing by, the sun coming and going. But inside that room, everything revolved around a motionless man and 2 hearts that did not want to let him go without a fight. Clara slept sitting up with her head resting on the edge of the bed. Father Mateo read psalms in a low voice. Sometimes he changed the rosary from one hand to the other, trying to keep his faith strong, even though he was already tired. They took turns. When Clara had to go eat something, Mateo stayed. When he went to the chapel, she came back. "Dad, are you there?" she asked almost every day, bringing her lips close to his ear. "If you are, just listen, just feel, because I'm here, and I'm not leaving without you." She took her father's guitar to his room and played the songs that he and her mother used to dance to. Sometimes she was out of tune, sometimes she got the chords wrong, but she kept smiling through her tears. "Do you remember this one, Dad? Mom used to sing it to me when you worked late, and she would say that Dad would be home soon. You always came back. Come back now, too." Father Mateo watched all this with a lump in his throat. Silently, he thanked God for still having the opportunity to be there. Even though Ernesto didn't respond, even though the machines were the only constant sounds in the room, he felt that something was still beating, still alive. One cloudy afternoon, the priest sat down next to the bed and took Ernesto's hand. He covered it with both hands as if he wanted to stop time. He looked at his friend's sleeping face and spoke in a hoarse but firm voice. "I met you when you were a child, remember? Running barefoot along the river. your shirt open, laughing at everything. Now we are two old men, Ernesto. Two old men who left many things for later. He paused. His chest rose and fell slowly. I saw you laugh. I saw you love. I saw you lose yourself too. But I also lost myself. And yet, you saved me. Once, when I almost stopped being a father, it was you who reminded me who I was. Tears fell from the corners of his eyes. Slowly. Now it's my turn. It's my turn to stay here by your side, not to leave you alone. He squeezed Ernesto's hand tighter. But if you want to go, go in peace. Really, no one here is going to stop you. But I only ask one thing of you. Mateo took a deep breath. His voice trembled, but he continued. Just please don't leave without saying goodbye to your daughter. The room fell silent. Only the low sound of the heart monitor filled the air. But something there changed, as if each word had touched not only the body, but what lay beyond it. And in that moment, all that remained was to wait with love, with faith, and with an open heart. Dawn fell heavily on the hospital. Clara dozed with her head resting on the edge of her father's bed, her hand intertwined with his, even though he did not squeeze it back. Father Mateo prayed softly in a corner of the room with the rosary between his fingers, asking God not for a great miracle, just a chance. Ernesto's breathing remained slow, controlled by the machines. The constant sound of the heart monitor filled the room. Beep, beep. Always the same, always faint. A thread of life that still held on until something happened. Mateo looked up. He didn't know why, but something made him look at his old friend's face, and he saw a tear. Yes, a tear slowly rolling down the corner of Ernesto's eye. Clara, he whispered. She woke up startled. She looked at him without understanding. Look, he pointed with a trembling finger. He cried. Clara froze. She looked at her dad's face, then at the monitor. The sound was changing. What had been weak and irregular was now becoming steady, rhythmic, as if the heart wanted to beat again with gusto. She brought her face very close to his. Dad, can you hear me? Nothing. But then, slowly, very slowly, Ernesto's eyelids began to move. At first, it was an almost invisible movement. Then his eyes opened. Small, tired, but alive. Mateo brought his hands to his face and knelt on the floor, overcome with emotion. Clara held her father's face with both hands, as if it were made of glass, her eyes filled with tears, her heart beating fast. Dad, it's me. It's Clara. He looked at her. It took him a moment to focus. His eyes tried to understand everything. The room, the lights, his daughter's face, her touch, her voice. With effort, he moved his lips softly, scraping out a whisper that came from his soul. I'm sorry, she cried. No, Dad, don't say that. He continued slowly. Daughter, thank you for waiting. She hugged him right there, carefully, afraid of hurting him, but with an urgency that only love knows. I waited for you my whole life, and now I'm here. Her tears fell on his face, but he didn't care. He felt for the first time in years. He felt. And in that simple room, among machines, cables, and prayers, a miracle happened. Not the miracle of resurrection, but the miracle of reconnecting, of returning, of listening, of feeling, of saying what had never been said. And in that moment, there was no pain, only love, alive, present, true. The room was still silent, but now it was a different silence, a silence full of life. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. Clara did not let go of her father's hand for a second. Her gaze was one of surprise, love, and relief all at once. Ernesto, his eyes still heavy, seemed to want to say more, but the words did not come, and at that moment they were not needed. She leaned over slowly, without haste, tears streaming down her face, and rested her forehead against his. You're back, Dad. You're back. His breathing was weak, but present. Clara ran her hand over his face as carefully as if she were touching something sacred. I've waited my whole life for this moment. I waited for you to really see me, not just with your eyes, but with your heart." Ernesto slowly raised his arm, an enormous effort. His trembling hand sought her shoulder, touched her gently, then pulled her closer, hugging her. And then time stood still. For the first time in her life, Clara felt that her father was truly embracing her. It wasn't a mechanical gesture. It wasn't out of habit. It was with strength, with soul, with devotion. She let herself sink into that embrace, resting her face on his chest. Tears fell and wet his hospital gown, and he too cried silently. Only his eyes were full, his face pressed against her hair. They said nothing. There was no need to say anything. Everything was contained in that embrace. The childhood she missed, the affection that never came, the forgotten birthdays, the calls that never came, the lonely Christmases, the swallowed anger, the silent love. Everything was there in a single embrace that took 40 years to arrive. Mateo stood at the door watching silently, his eyes filled with tears and a slight smile. He didn't want to interrupt. He just wanted to keep that moment in his memory, because in the midst of so much silence, there at last were two hearts saying everything, and saying it loudly. The next day, the sun shone softly through the hospital room window. The light touched Ernesto's face gently, as if the sky itself were asking for silence at that moment. The old man was now more awake, still weak, but conscious. His eyes looked more alive, more present, and something inside him also seemed to have changed. Clara was sitting next to the bed, reading a passage from the Bible in a low voice. When she finished, he slowly turned his face toward her. "I want to confess." She looked at him in surprise. "With the priest?" she asked slowly. He nodded. Clara got up immediately and went into the hallway. She called Father Mateo, who appeared a few minutes later with a serious but kind face. Mateo entered the room, closed the door slowly, and sat down next to his friend. They remained silent for a few seconds. Ernesto looked at the ceiling as if searching for courage within himself. "I don't even know where to start," he said in a weak voice. "With your heart," replied the priest without haste. Ernesto took a deep breath. His trembling hand rested on the sheet. "I was a man afraid, Mateo. I spent my whole life running away from what I wanted most. Love, affection, being present. I thought that if I got close to people, they would be disappointed in me, just as I was disappointed in myself." He paused for a long time, swallowed hard, and continued. "I distanced myself from those who loved me most. I hid the truth. I was harsh and cold out of fear, because deep down I never felt worthy of being loved." Mateo's eyes were filled with tears, but he listened in silence. "But in these last few days, I received everything I didn't deserve. Forgiveness, love, a hug, my daughter's gaze telling me she loves me, even though I wasn't the father she needed." A tear slowly rolled down Ernesto's cheek. "I don't know if God will forgive me, but just for having lived through this now in this room, I already feel cleaner, lighter." Father Mateo took his hand. "God knows your heart, Ernesto, and whoever loves is already on the path to salvation." The old man smiled, a weak but sincere smile. Then he was silent for a few seconds and called his daughter. "Daughter," she approached him. "Tell me, Dad. I wanted to ask you for something. Anything." Ernesto closed his eyes for a moment, as if searching for courage deep within his soul. "I would like to meet my son, whom I have never seen." Clara bit her lip, her eyes filled with tears. She squeezed his hand tightly. "I've already found him, Dad." His eyes opened slowly. "He's on his way." Ernesto couldn't say anything. He just closed his eyes and let another tear fall. This time a tear of hope, knowing that despite everything, there is still time. Even if it's not much, there is still time. The house was simple, small, with peeling walls and old furniture, but that night it felt full of life. The wooden table in the center of the room was carefully set. Deep plates, antique cutlery, different glasses. Nothing matched, but everything was beautiful in a sincere way. There was hot soup, fresh bread, and a rich aroma that filled the whole place. Clara was running around the kitchen putting the finishing touches in place while Father Mateo set the chairs in their places. Don Ernesto was sitting at the head of the table, thin, still weak, but with a sparkle in his eyes that no one had seen in a long time. The blue shirt, the same one Clara had set aside for the wake, now clothed the body of a man who, against all odds, was still alive. His son arrived a few minutes later. When he walked through the door, silence filled the room. A simple man in his 40s, with eyes very similar to Clara's, with an expression somewhere between nervous and excited. He stood at the door with a small package in his hands. Ernesto looked at him and could hardly meet his eyes. His voice trembled. "Is that you?" The son nodded, smiled, his eyes filled with tears. "It's me." Clara took him by the hand, brought him closer, and then, for the first time in their lives, father and son looked each other in the eye. For a few seconds they said nothing, just looked at each other, until the son slowly approached, opened his arms, and said, "I had a good stepfather. He took care of me, taught me how to be a man. But I always wanted to know who my dad was. I always wanted to see you, hear your voice, know your face, and I kept this hug here my whole life." And then he hugged him, a strong, silent hug. Ernesto held that man as if he were holding on to the time that had slipped away. He closed his eyes and cried a lot. "Forgive me, son," he whispered, almost breathless. "You are already forgiven, Dad. I just wanted to see you well." When they sat down at the table, they didn't say much, but their eyes spoke all the time. Ernesto raised his glass with trembling hands. He looked at Clara, at his son, at Mateo. "I got a second chance, not because of me, but because of her faith, because of my daughter's faith, who didn't give up on me." Father Mateo smiled, gently touching his old friend's arm. "There is still time to experience beautiful things, Ernesto." And so, in that simple house, full of stories, sorrows, and miracles, they had dinner together for the first time, 3 people and a priest, brought together by something stronger than time, a love that endures, that persists, and that, even if it comes late, still has value. The church was empty. It was late, and the sun was streaming through the high windows, painting the floor with orange tones. Everything was silent. Only Clara's footsteps could be heard among the wooden pews. She walked slowly with a candle in her hands. Her heart was calm, but still tight from so many things experienced in such a short time. She stopped in front of the altar, looked at the image of Christ, and stood there for a few seconds in silence, as if speaking without using her mouth. Then she lit the candle. Her hands trembled a little. The flame grew slowly, gently illuminating her face. She closed her eyes and whispered softly, just loud enough for God to hear, "Thank you for not taking him yet, for letting him stay, long enough to hear that I love him." A tear fell, but it was a tear of relief, of peace, of someone who had made peace with life and with time. Outside, sitting on a stone bench in the church garden, Don Ernesto looked up at the sky, his eyes closed, his face turned toward the sun, the light touching his skin like a warm embrace. Clara approached and sat down next to him. They said nothing for a few minutes until he spoke in a calm voice, almost as if thinking out loud. "I don't know how much time I have left. It may be little, it may be a lot, but now I just want to enjoy every breakfast, every laugh, every smell in the street, everything I let slip by." He turned his face and looked at her. "And if it were now, my daughter, if I had to leave today, I would leave in peace, because I heard your voice, I hugged you, I saw you smiling at me, and I discovered that it is still possible to love." Even after everything, Clara rested her head on his shoulder. The church bell rang in the background, soft, slow, like a beautiful ending to a difficult chapter. And there, in that sunset, there was no pain, only gratitude and complete love. Even if it came late, because when it's true, it's never too late. Have you ever experienced a reunion like this? Or are you still waiting for it? Have you forgiven people? Have you said "I love you" today? Right here in the comments. I'd love to know how this story touched you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because every day there are real profound stories that touch the heart. And if your chest still feels tight, click on the video that's playing on the screen now. It's a moving story that has already made many people cry, think about their decisions, and even make peace with those they love. Go on, I'll wait for you there.